Okay, welcome, welcome. Thank you everybody for attending this Shaw Foundation event, How to Build a Loving City. My name is Patrick St. John. I'm the Narrative and Digital Campaign Director at the Shaw Foundation for Public Education. I'm joined to discuss the issues in our new Loving Cities Index report with these fantastic folks. Let me introduce them real quick and I'll give them a chance to say a bit about themselves before we dive in. Let me start with Dr. Tanja Rucker, who is the Interim Senior Executive and Director for the Center for Municipal Practice and Leadership, Education, Advancement, and Development at the National League of Cities. Welcome, Tanja.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. As noted, I am currently serving as the Interim Executive Director for the Center for Municipal Practice and the Center for LEAD at the National League of Cities, and we are excited about the work and the role that local government is playing in this nation today. And so I'm glad to be with you and an opportunity to share a little bit about the National League of Cities and the ways that we're supporting local governments in this moment. So thank you for having us.
Okay, thank you, Tanja. And we're also joined by Leon Smith, who's the Executive Director of Citizens for Juvenile Justice. Welcome, Leon.
Thank you so much for having me today, and really excited about today's conversation and really diving into what really makes up a loving city, especially as it relates to residents in our communities who are less fortunate, and what's needed to make our cities a loving and caring place for them as well.
Thank you so much, Leon. Yes, that is the topic we'll be discussing today. I think to start off, for those who are not familiar with the Shaw Foundation, we're a BIPOC-led public fund that pools philanthropic funding and uses it to fuel racial and education justice movements across the country. As an intermediary, for more than 30 years now, we've been working at the intersections of a lot of things, between funders and grassroots movements, between different facets of the education justice movement, like parents, youth, educators, policymakers, and crucial for today's conversation, between research and action. Our emphasis when it comes to research and data is we want to be responsive to the needs of our grantees and our partners to commission and deliver research and data that speaks to people's lived experiences, uncovers important truths, and crucially spurs people to action. And so I think for just one example, we recently, last year, produced a new edition of our report on Black male students in public education. We started releasing that all the way back in 2004 to shine a spotlight on outcome differences when we disaggregate student data by both race and gender. The most recent edition looks at 15 key school districts and finds a conclusion that probably will not be super surprising for both our panelists and those watching: systemic disparities across race and gender that are rooted in local, state, and federal systems that we all live and work in. And of course, we all know that factors impact a child's academic achievement, career options, and even life expectancy that reside far outside the schoolhouse. So the question we're bringing to today's conversation, and the question we brought to this report, is how do we better understand the ecosystems of institutions and policies that surround our children, not just to understand where they are, but crucially, how to change those systems so everybody has an opportunity to learn and thrive. So I'm going to share my screen real quick, and we can first do a bit of a dive into the index itself, talk about the issues that we cover. We're then going to use Boston as a case study to examine the way these frameworks look as we apply that to a city. And then we're going to have a fairly open conversation with our two panelists about how we can move this into action and how cities themselves can be terrains of real progress, regardless of what's happening elsewhere. So for those who haven't downloaded a copy yet, we strongly encourage you to do so. Follow along. This is a large and comprehensive report. And so therefore we can't reasonably cover everything in an hour. And this will be a fairly high level overview. And we want to sort of go into, first off, the why the Loving Cities Index. There are four, I think, crucial central questions and answers that led us to deliver an index like this. First off is, like I said earlier, students exist outside the classroom. And while this is a bit of a truism, I think a lot of folks who are in the advocacy space, in policy spaces, it's easy, especially when you're focused on something like education, even within that issue bucket, there is a universe of policies, of data and research, policy levers that you can change to actually impact outcomes. But I think we all know that the children that go into these schools, they bring with them not just their backpack and their coat, but all the supports and disadvantages that are placed on them outside. That can be the quality of the air they breathe. That could be the wage of their parents. That could be the availability of healthy food. Are they coming into the classroom hungry? Availability of healthcare and health insurance. Can they actually see the whiteboard, the blackboard at the front of the room? Even beyond those sort of more obvious points, there's a universe out there that has direct classroom and therefore academic and life chance impacts that we wanted to bring into the conversation. And related to that, our next sort of North Star for this is we've found that outcomes make it easy for us to focus on individuals. But if we look at the inputs about what we're bringing to a system or a situation, we can then focus on systems. And as the data and research show, it's systems change that can actually move the needle on these most important factors. So whereas, for example, an outcome could be whether or not a child graduates or passes a standardized test. If we look at the individual level, look at those outcomes, it's easy to lose sight of these larger factors in play. But if we look at the inputs, say per pupil funding equivalency, or the availability of AP classes or gifted and talented programs, these inputs have a much greater effect on the outcomes than simply focusing on a single stat like a graduation rate. Third North Star. We believe that when we present data, especially those of us who have a particular point of view, and I would argue all of us do, all our institutions do, whether they're explicit or implicit, we need to bake our solutions into how we tell the problems. And this sort of goes into the earlier second point about the danger of focusing on outcomes. Given the current inequities in our public schools, in the cities that we examined in this report, and writ large, one could, and we have seen people do this, make an argument not for improving these systems, improving our public schools, but actually making an argument to scrap them altogether. So whereas researchers with equity and justice in mind can say, for example, when we did look at the crisis of lack of support that Black male students in particular are getting in our public schools, some can, and we have seen, used that very data, use those data sets not to argue for more supports, but actually to withdraw them, to privatize, to reduce this, because they say, well, this is failing and therefore we should move the money elsewhere. So with the Loving Cities Index, we wanted to say, as we understand the problems, can we depict them and understand them in a way that prefigures the solutions to those problems? And hopefully you'll see that and be very obvious as we go along. And then fourthly, we need to tell a story about love. And it's something that can get lost in data conversations, research conversations, the black and white of policymaking. When it comes down to the individual level, we need to be asking ourselves and our cities, do our cities love our children and families. And what would our cities look like if they did? Would they have food deserts for the lowest income neighborhoods? Of course not. Would they have easy public transit for those, especially who need it most, who may not have access to a car? Absolutely. Would they provide the kind of restorative practices and positive discipline supports in schools rather than push kids into the school to prison pipeline? Absolutely. And just as budgets famously are statements of morality, of statements of our priorities, the systems that we build and we live in will answer for us. Do our cities love our kids? And so as we think through this, the next 45 minutes or so, what would a loving city look like to you? We'd love to for you to toss your thoughts in the chat. What are some of these factors that live outside the classroom that impact maybe your life, your child's life when you were in school? Because this is a holistic conversation that we need to spur among all of us, not just policymakers and funders. So to try and get a handle on how do we quantify the love that cities and ecosystems provide, we found 25 key indicators across these 4 chambers of the heart. First is care. And we define care as access to mental and physical health services from birth, nutritional food, and healthy community spaces. A loving city needs to provide its children with stability too, through consistent expectations and practices that reinforce a culture of inclusion and healing among students and adults. We also need to show our children commitment through economically and civically empowered communities that democratize access to healthy living and learning. And lastly, capacity. We need to provide well-resourced learning climates that meet the physical, emotional, and academic needs of students. So what does this look like in practice? Here are the indicators for each section. These indicators were picked through a combination of what data is available, and pin that, we're going to talk about that in a bit, and what best gets at the kind of qualitative questions we're asking of these cities. So for care, it's, does this young person have access to health insurance, access to healthy foods? Is there a problem with low birth weight among children in the city? Do children have access to parks, access to mental health care? For stability, it's everything from livable wages. So, does a child's parents have the income to support them? Access to public transit, affordable housing, right? Can they actually afford the rent or the mortgage where they're living to keep a safe and quality roof over someone's head? One of the classic intersections of education and housing, of course, is how districts are lined up. And the carve-outs of districts that we saw during the white flight era, desegregation in the middle of the last century, really brought that home. It seems every year or two we have examples in the news headlines of parents doing their hardest to move a child into a different district, often at great personal expense through more expensive cost of living or a longer commute for them, just so this child can get into what they consider a better school. This leads into things like our commitment indicators. So is there access to early childhood education for all our kids? What are the policies around K-12 suspensions and expulsions? Are we referring children to law enforcement, which is a practice that everywhere it's been studied, when it's been implemented, it's had disparate impact. Do we have anti-bullying policies? Do we have restorative practices where we resolve conflicts without the use of the carceral system? And then for capacity, similarly, we have questions of what is the capacity of these schools and the school systems? So that's everything from, is the school integrated across a neighborhood, and is the district across its city? Do kids have access to advanced curriculum? What's the average teacher experience? And crucially, especially in the middle of a housing and a cost of living crisis, what are the teacher salaries? Are we actually paying teachers what they need to thrive? So this most recent report, which came out last month, looks at 15 cities. So on this map, you'll see marked in red, these are the cities we're covering this year. One of our selection criteria is we want districts and cities that are geographically dispersed across the country, and cities that have a significant population of children of color as well. You can see in a lighter shade of white, these are the previous cities in our 2018 and 2020 reports that we went through. And to just zoom in a bit on these 15 cities, once we evaluated them by the criteria, and we'll like I said, we're going to show Boston as an example of this. We gave cities a score, and crucially, the score is not it's not a ranking. It's not, well, for Pittsburgh to do better in this, Wilmington has to do worse, right? These cities have unique histories, unique geographies, unique economies. It's very hard to compare apples to apples in any meaningful way like that. And so we decided to go purely based on the percentage of supports that we were able to measure, ranking from copper at the bottom all the way to platinum. We have not yet found a city that provides supports to the degree to warrant platinum. And this year, our first silver and gold cities have been found. So San Diego in California and Boston are at the top for this report. So if we look, though, given the vast geographic and situational disparities of these cities, we do find some trends. So just to skip through a few of these are commonalities across a lot of the cities that we examined. And so we can start to think of, all right, what are these cross-cutting issues, often that are dictated by state and federal policy, that we need to look at? And hopefully these could be areas of cooperation between cities too. So for each of these sections, and we go into this in a bit more detail in the full report, things like air quality is a consistently difficult problem, especially in neighborhoods of color. Low birth weight as well. For stability, we're seeing relatively high voter turnout compared to past years as we compared longitudinally, which is great. But affordable housing and livable wages, we're moving away from where we want to be. Similarly with commitment, we're seeing improvements for access to early childhood education. It's still uneven, but there is an understanding, especially in our larger cities, that this is a key intervention to prevent a whole host of problems down the line. So this is a smart use of taxpayer dollars. Under capacity, we have a huge range in school economic integration. And some of this is because we'll look at a city like Houston, which has a panoply of school districts, or we'll look at a city like Boston, where BPS, Boston Public Schools, covers the vast majority of students. And like I mentioned earlier, we should talk about data. As I imagine a lot of you have seen headlines starting January 20th, the access to data itself has always been a political question, has always been a question of justice and equity. It's become even more so now. We've seen at the federal level, entire databases go dark, servers disconnected, and this includes everything from climate data to healthcare data, everything in between. And this has had an impact on how we can tell stories about ourselves, the communities we live in, and the world we live in. This was a particular concern for us as we were gathering the data for the Loving Cities Index as the presidential transfer of power happened. And so one of one of our priorities, which our data partners at PTKO handled excellently, was before that changeover, just in case, download data sets from Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights, and DOJ to try and make sure, at least if it goes down, we can continue to do our analysis. There's a section in the report that shares this title, that we measure what matters. This is a problem that exists in one way or another for decades now. Just to give you an example, we relied on, for our Black male student reports, Department of Education data that disaggregated graduation rates by race and gender, not just race and then separately with gender. Once, I believe this was in the Obama administration, once that was no longer required by the federal government for districts to send in, a lot of districts simply stopped reporting the data. There's an understandable rationale. You have limited resources for reporting. But that functionally meant it was a lot more difficult for us to understand what's going on, and therefore to design policies that could actually move the needle on it. So one of our recommendations in the report is access to data should be a key clarion call from policymakers to advocates to funders who fund research, to make sure that we have the data we need to find out the solutions that actually work. And so quickly, we'll do a city spotlight on Boston. Boston scored 78%. What does 78% mean? Well, we took that as an aggregate of how the city supported its children across all the indicators we talked to. And so this is the kind of dashboard we build out for each city. You can see the overall score by chamber, and then get a glimpse in terms of where are the strong and weak spots for each indicator. So for example, exposure to air toxins is a point of challenge for Boston. However, commitment, Boston is, in terms of how we measure these things, doing very well. So if we dig into, starting with care, here's a breakdown of those 6 key indicators. And what we do is we provide the numbers. We also provide a benchmark. So based on best practices, with our data partners, here's what ideally a city should be providing. For example, Boston is providing 98%, or ensuring 98% of young people have health insurance. Our benchmark is 97, so squeaking on by through. You get top marks for that. However, for example, in the lower left, exposure to air toxins, Boston received a score of 67%, whereas cities should have less than 40%. And crucially, and this speaks to our question of how we pose these issues should prefigure our solutions. If I go back one slide, we can get a sense just from how we're labeling these indicators, how to improve, how a city could get better. So if the city wants to get better at access to parks, for example, the solution is pretty clear. Build more parks, make them more accessible. In this year's report, which is an addition from previous ones, we've added loving steps. So for every single indicator, we have multiple starting points. These certainly aren't one-size-fits-all solutions, but starting points that policymakers and advocates can think of as they're considering how to improve their score. So for example, with healthy foods, you could establish municipal or nonprofit supermarkets. If there are food deserts where that simply is not an option, or for the private sector has not, either has not gone in or have pulled up stakes and left. Access to city parks, we can talk about equitability in terms of access. There can be underutilized spaces in cities that could be turned into parks. And so as we go through, things like stability, commitment, and capacity, we can see where the strengths and challenges reside for Boston. I do want to provide one note here for school economic integration. This also speaks to a data question. The common measure of low-income students and where they're dispersed inside a school system and inside a city is around eligibility for free and reduced price lunch. For cities who have honestly done the right thing and made free lunch universal, we therefore don't actually have that data to understand the intricacies of where students are residing in terms of income. So we don't ding a city for doing that. We remove that from the score, of course. But this speaks to a larger question around data access. How do we better understand the economic and class cleavages of these cities when we can, when we've moved on from using free lunch as an indicator? So now I'd love to pull in our panelists and we can talk about how we turn these insights into action. How can we build the loving cities where we live? And this can be not just the cities that we include in this report, but the cities that you're all coming from. And so I'd love to first bring Leon into this. Leon, if you could talk a bit about your organization, Citizens for Juvenile Justice, based in Boston, of course, as you've really worked at the intersections of a lot of different struggles for justice and equity. I'd go so far as to say a lot of those data points in a little, green, yellow, and red boxes. You've had a footprint in those over the years as you build out what are really cross-sector solutions to these problems. So, what do you think policymakers and organizers can learn from what's been happening in Boston and what you've experienced working there?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Patrick, again for the opportunity to speak and for spotlighting Boston and some of the important progress that has been made in improving the lives of children and families. And for starters, I will say that that has happened through embracing reform rather than doubling down on the status quo. Now, as someone who is a proud child of rural Appalachia, one of the most under-resourced parts of the country, my viewpoint of whether or not a city is loving is really rooted in how are people who are struggling and less fortunate treated. In particular, how young people who are struggling to navigate their way through childhood trauma or other challenges on the pathway to adulthood, how are they being treated? Are they being greeted with support and services, or are they being greeted with judgment and condemnation when they have those struggles? And with that framing, I would say when you look at the advances Boston has made, it has been driven by shifts in policy and practice that address root causes of youth behavior, that provide supports for their need. And then when you make the financial investment in services for young people, you get that return on investment in young people doing better. So Boston has really benefited from 3 rounds of key reform that has happened on the state level here in Massachusetts. In 2018, Massachusetts embarked on comprehensive criminal justice system reform with significant changes focused on the juvenile system. In 2020, we embarked on police reform, including reforms that address the unique harms of overzealous and biased policing on young people, and particularly addressing police presence in school hardening. And in 2022, Massachusetts passed comprehensive mental health reform in light of the ongoing impact of the pandemic. So whenever reform is advanced, there are always going to be naysayers who criticize, who doubt, who stoke fear. But when you look at where we are right now, it is proof that when you truly invest in reform, those reforms have impact. And a true loving city are those who have courageous leadership, who are intentional in building pathways and pipelines to the services that all citizens, in particular our citizens who have less and who are less fortunate, really need.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's interesting. You've mentioned a number of the reforms that actually didn't really go through Boston City Hall per se. It went through Beacon Hill. These were statewide legislative efforts. And I think that leads me into my next question, which is we can get good policy at the state level.
Yeah.
oftentimes that means implementation is left to the cities. All right, here's how you build it out in a way that makes sense for your community, like Boston or Lawrence or um, Worcester. How do you, as not, in your role, not as a policymaker directly, but as someone who advocates for policy change, what is that next step? How do we make sure that beyond the letter of the law changing, the actual lived lives of our children and families are changing?
Well, yeah, so at CFJJ, we also do a lot of civic engagement work, particularly with young people who are emerging into adulthood. And our message is always, it's so much more than just election day, and it's so much more than just when a policy it's passed. It's continuing to stay engaged with your decision makers. It's continuing to follow up to make sure that once you have those policies passed, that they are actually followed through with and that implementation happens and implementation happens with fidelity. It's also important that in the news cycle, there's so much attention on the federal reality. We have to remember the tremendous impact that both state and local politics have on our day-to-day lives. And so we have had changes through the Boston School Committee, the superintendent's office. When you look at some positive reforms there, Boston does not suspend young people between pre-kindergarten and second grade. That went through local. Several years ago, Boston had only 2 restorative justice professionals who were trying to implement restorative justice practices across 125 schools. All right. Mission impossible. But when organizations like ours, in collaboration and in partnership with members of the community, we pushed Boston to expand the numbers of restorative justice coordinators. So you have that push on the municipal level through City Hall, but state representatives and state senators who serve our urban communities also play a critical role, both advocating directly for their constituents and collectively, for example, our Black and Latino caucus in moving policy. So it's understanding that you should be levying both local and state policy, pushing and really building in coalition. And when I say coalition, not just statewide organizations like ours, not just attorneys and advocates and professionals, but making sure you're reaching into communities for those youth-led, parent-led, and community-led organizers and organizations to push reform, but then using both data from a qualitative data and checking in with people in communities so you have both quantitative and qualitative metrics with which to measure, are the reforms that we fought so hard to pass already being implemented properly? And then also when you have those successes and you have the naysayers pushing to try to roll back the gains you've gotten, using data and using the voices in communities to say, nope, you are not going to take this one outlying case and roll back this progress because the data shows that this reform works and we need to stay on that path.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that questions around data and the ability to even see what's happening is, I think there are two things that come to mind. First off, what has been your organization's experience actually finding out the data, getting reliable information to find out, for example, how many restorative practitioners were in that district, or what is the incarceration rate for people under 18, to questions of the number of police officers in a given school. So I think that's one side of the question in terms of how we find the data to tell the stories and make change. But CFJJ has also weighed in on what government's using with the data itself. For example, I know recently you all pushed back on the policy of data sharing for juvenile fingerprints, especially in a moment when ICE is detaining a lot of young people, including those in and around the Boston area.
Yeah, so data has always been CFJJ, we're in our 31st year, and it has always been central to what we do. We use data to map out youth serving systems, be it on a state and local level, and really looking at the decision points in their processes, both overall to see if young people are getting the positive results that they should, but with an unapologetically anti-racist lens to identify decision points where young people of color are being treated more harshly or are getting worse outcomes than their white counterparts. And so it's a Sisyphean task because we've been pushing for so long, and we have made advances in Massachusetts. From that 2018 Criminal Justice Reform Act I mentioned, we had the creation legislatively of a Juvenile Justice Policy and Data Board, which pulls data from youth serving state agencies and compiles that into an annual report to the legislature. This also made publicly available, where we're able to see many of those decision points. That's data when I started my career we did not have access to. So data has improved, but we still have significant gaps in data. For example, if we're going to have a conversation about school safety, you have to have data to talk about what's happening. You can't simply pull one viral fight in the school lunchroom and say, see, that's what's happening everywhere. Prove it by the data. Prove it by data on incidents. Prove it by data on your school-based arrests. And yet we see time and again in Boston and beyond where people are pulling individual incidents to make sweeping generalizations, but when you look, they're not reporting or they're underreporting data. And so something we do through public record requests, and at times legal action when those requests are not complied with, we're constantly pushing through that for data. We push it to inform our own advocacy, but we're very proud to say that we take the data that we get, we analyze it, and then through our public education work, we make sure that's available to people in communities, all communities, but especially in impacted communities. It's so important that when we're able to fight and get data, it is it is it is published in a way that is digestible. So if you're a single mother who wants to go to your school committee meeting, you can take that data, you can pull points that support the story you want to tell, and you've got that fusion of quantitative and qualitative where you're telling your story, but your story is a part of a broader systemic trend, which makes the case for change. And that's something that we really try to inform advocacy broadly, whether it's attorneys using our data in motions in court, or whether it's just people in communities using that data when they testify before their city or town council or their school committee. So, data is really critical, but I'd be remiss if I didn't add it's more critical than ever in light of the actions of the Trump administration. We have seen a significant rollback of the US Department of Education's data reporting requirements. Um, Civil rights data collection is under attack. The JJDPA, Juvenile Justice Delinquency and Prevention Act, they've had federal requirements to track racial and ethnic disparities. That has been under attack. The Trump administration gutted the National Center for Education Statistics, which is the federal department that analyzes a lot of data on disparities in our school and our discipline processes. So at a time where data that can be used to identify negative trends and especially identify inequities in treatment is being slowly dismantled and scrubbed on the federal level, it is more important than ever that we advocate for policies and practices on the state and municipal level to ensure that we have readily available, cross-tabulated data that we can use to show not just race or gender or socioeconomic status or disability, but to be able to cross-tabulate that data to identify disparities for young people who fall at the intersection of those identities. To not just identify that the disparities are there, often we know the disparities are there, but using those disparities to promote changes in policies and practice to address those disparities and to make our schools and communities much more equitable.
Yes, that is absolutely the goal. Thanks for laying that out in really clear, concrete terms. I'd like to turn now to Tanja. For a topic like this, I can think of few organizations better suited to provide a good perspective on this than the National League of Cities. I'd love for you to just start out, tell us a bit about the work that you and the League is doing in terms of supporting its members, and let us know what are city level policymakers thinking about and talking about in this present moment.
Sure. Thank you, Patrick. And once again, so glad and honored to be here this afternoon. Um, before I jump in, I just want to go back to Boston. It's where we started your example, and I think it's befitting. The city of Boston has been such a great member for NLC, and deeply, I think we would not be here and having this conversation today if it had not been for Mayor Menino. When I first came to NLC in 2005, when the Institute, the part of NLC where we focus on the human side of the human infrastructure was created by Mayor Menino of Boston and Mayor Riley of Charleston. Those two elected officials felt that the National League of Cities, if we were going to really be a place that helped cities thrive and help them to be vibrant, that they needed a place dedicated to supporting the human side of cities. And so Mayor Menino was a founder of the Institute for Youth Education and Families, which jump-started NLC's technical assistance. And since 2000, the city of Boston has been a constant beacon of light. Leadership matters, and certainly and the city of Boston, not just at the mayoral level, but the council level, the senior staff at city departments, like your department heads and community members, just decades of an innovative work. And this work has kind of culminated. Just a few weeks ago, we released a report, Decades in the Making, and Boston was one of 4 cities that have been just exemplary in a number of leadership ways for children and families. So I just wanted to just say, speaking to our heart at NLC, and when you talk about Boston, but there is a myriad of local communities, cities, towns, and villages, and that's what we're here for, the National League of Cities. We've built a membership of local leaders that's focused on improving the quality of life for their current and also their future constituents. We have over 100 years of dedication to making sure that we strengthen and advance local governments. And NLC has gained trust and support of over 3,000 member cities of all sizes and geographic regions represented. And we represent more than 200 million people across the country. And our mission is to relentlessly advocate to protect the interest of cities, towns, and villages. And we do this by influencing federal policy, strengthening local leadership, and driving innovative solutions. And in challenging times like these, this is really important work. So our work with local communities include curricular programs. We provide technical assistance, peer networks, multi-sector partnerships, membership. We convene members, and we provide direct assistance to city governments. I referenced the part of NLC that works kind of on the human service side, and that's the National League of Cities Institute. We are the research and education affiliate, and we provide research and technical assistance to cities to help them more effectively work on behalf of children, youth, families, community stakeholders, and make sure they're committed to building inclusive communities, improving health, equity, and well-being for all. And as I noted, we do this through housing peer learning networks. We serve a myriad of subject matter expertise. We have economic and workforce development, housing and community development, sustainability and innovation, health and wellness, education, and youth development. So in all of these subject areas, we have worked with cities for usually 12 to 18 months in different cohorts. We have over the years amassed a number of peer learning networks. It's important for cities to have spaces where they can get together with cities of similar sizes, similar interests, and we're able to house these peer learning networks where they can learn and hear from each other. We provide technical assistance, direct one-on-one work in cities. We host leadership academies, and we promote a culture of just health and well-being, and we make sure that we are a resource to our members so that they have effective agendas that really impact the well-being of families and kids. And you know, I think the second part of your question gets at to like, what are some of our members feeling right now in this moment, how they're thinking about this moment. And I would just safely say that we knew change was coming. You know, we've been here before, usually with, you know, a new administration, there's shifts in federal priorities. But this is an unprecedented time, and our members are thinking about how do they maintain and hold the line for families and residents, and at the same time, like not making themselves a target, putting a target on their back from the administration. So thinking about good governance, efficiencies, and how to partner and leverage the work. And you mentioned, Patrick, as you were mentioning earlier, you know, there's state level. I think the role of government is just at all levels. We see the pullback at the federal level. Much more is falling on the shoulders of state government and local government. And I'm proud to say that at NLC, about 5 years ago, we started a government in action series, and we have been working feverishly with cities to partner with their county counterparts and their state counterparts. And we feel here that if we have good governance and good alignment with city, county, and state, that's just going to bode well for the well-being of our residents. And so we think at this time, even just going deeper in how we help support our members, you know, we've got our heads down, making sure that, you know, those that are closest, you know, at the local level, you're closest to your residents, and we want to make sure that, you know, we support them at that level, but also how do we help our members work more closely and align with their county and their state counterparts. And so that government in action is really important. And so our members are thinking about, like, you know, in this moment, how do we kind of even go deeper in that space, but certainly holding the line for local residents while also being good partners with state and local government, and finding ways to still have a relationship and dialogue with our federal colleagues at this moment. So that's just a little bit about our work in the technical assistance space, hands-on with cities, and some of the things that they're thinking about in this current moment.
Yeah, I get that. I think looking structurally and historically, the classic line is states were meant to be the laboratories of democracy. In a lot of ways, the most innovative and interesting policy change, pilot programs are happening at the city level.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's certainly in the report, there are a lot of different openings for positive change toward equity and justice, for reducing those racial and gender disparities. Yeah, I would suggest, Tanisha, why don't you pitch our viewers on the city itself as a terrain where we can actually, regardless of what's happening at the federal level or state level, there are opportunities to really move the needle to improve lives for children and families.
Oh, for sure. I think, you know, certainly we know that at the local level, that there is clearly an opportunity to, you know, we're closest to what's happening at the local level. We are having our ears to the ground about what's impacting the well-being of families and kids, and being able in real time to get data about, like, you know, what's working, what's not working, and being able to connect and in real time adjust to, like, programming wise, to adjust to you know, what cities are needing, and to make tweaks in program and service delivery. So I think that's critical in terms of just being in real time. And in this moment when things are happening so fast, you know, it almost seems like you can't keep up. And so really having our ear to the ground and being close to those that are most impacted. Also at the local level, having that historical knowledge of communities, like, it's important. I think being able to have a deep understanding of local history, looking and recognizing that the context across race, gender, age, geography really positions local government to really be in a place of unique responsivity. And just the policy power at the local level. Elected officials have direct authority to influence change through local policy, ordinances, resolutions, and cities can kind of like shape public spaces. And you mentioned budgets. You look at budgets, it's like a moral document. It tells you where your values are and what your beliefs are. And it's also have the ability to impact systems in ways that reflect equity goals and meet community needs. And so I think that kind of public policy, local governance, budget, that's an opportunity where you can really see the value of local government. And also, I think really important in this moment is like that authentic community engagement. Cities have opportunity to shift from, like, instead of top down, can kind of share power. Now, I have to admit it's a shift, but I think sharing power and co-creating in this moment is going to be so important and vital, and having that engagement to build more inclusive and effective solutions. So having that voice and presence is going to be important. And I think, as you mentioned, innovation and flexibility, municipal governments can move more nimbly than, our federal and our state counterparts. And so this idea of where there's laboratories of innovation and all kinds of work is going to be really important. And many equity-centered programs and practices, like one of the things that we just so proud of is this participatory budget processing and equity impact assessments. They've all started at the city level and kind of scaled up. So, we just see the ability in this moment where there is such shifts and transformations in how federal funds are flowing and what agencies are still in existence. You got to kind of check day to day, but we do know that at the local level, if we have cities where in towns and villages, because it's not just the big cities, most of America is small to mid-sized communities. And but wherever you have you can bring together diverse populations, dynamic coalitions that include residents, businesses, grassroots, grass tops, and some of the more traditional and non-traditional institutions. And we can leverage City Hall as uniquely positioned to use the bully pulpit and to set tables where those diverse coalitions come together and are able to be responsive in real time.
Yes, I think that segues us wonderfully into our Q&A. We've gotten a couple through private messages, interesting questions. We're going to see how many we can get through in the few minutes remaining. You teed up a very important question, Tanja, and that is the relationship between policymakers at the municipal level and not just their constituents, but their organized constituents. So parent groups, youth groups, educators, not just the city workforce, but also private sector employers, those who provide housing. Let me carry on from that point that you, I think, so expertly laid out, Tanja, and ask Leon, from your perspective as an advocate, what can local policymakers who often have competing interests they need to balance better engage with and learn from community advocates and organizers? And how can those advocates and organizers sort of better engage with policymakers too, as we try and navigate this space?
Yeah, great question. And that's something that we're invested in. So CFJJ, our advocacy model is a collective action model. So on the state level, we convene the Massachusetts Juvenile Justice Coalition, which is over 60 organizations across Massachusetts. But when we work at the city or municipal level, we take that same approach of reaching out to a diverse collective of youth-led, parent-led, community-led organizations, as well as organizations that have a history of advocating in those communities, bringing folks to the table. And I think one of the keys to effective advocacy is making sure from the ground up, You develop that agenda for advocacy collectively, and you get that buy-in collectively, because then you have a situation where everyone, even coming from different perspectives, you've agreed on what the issue is, what the problem is, and what the change is, and therefore everyone has buy-in going forward. I always caution, especially statewide organizations, do not parachute into communities thinking that you have all of the answers, because there are people who have lived in those communities for generations, who have seen often patterns of discrimination or patterns of neglect happen, who already have very strong feelings and opinions and already know the ultimate expert of what to do to benefit a community are people who live in those communities every day. So having, all of those folks at the table from the very beginning and really intentionally making sure everyone is heard, everyone contributes, and really collectively building that campaign for change. And then that enables you to move forward. It enables you at for example, city council hearing, you have different people coming from their perspective, their own unique perspectives, but they're all pushing toward the agreed upon goal, which is a certain policy change.
Yeah, and I think that bringing in community members from the start, from the jump, I think is absolutely crucial, like you were saying. One of the questions that came in is certainly near and dear to our hearts, as well as a philanthropic intermediary. And the question is more or less asking, what should especially larger funders, what should they be thinking about in this moment as they consider not just the city as a place where innovation and progress toward equity and justice can happen, but also to break out of funding silos where a health funder will fund a health program, an education funder will fund an education program, and ne'er the twain shall meet. And oftentimes they'll be convening the same people, but maybe they won't have that kind of grassroots from the bottom of collaboration that you get when it's more community directed. So I know both of you all have engaged with funders in the past to support various aspects of your work. If there are quite a few funders on this call now tuning in, I'm curious what your advice would be as program officers are thinking about how to best use their grant dollars to move the needle in a moment where the issues, of course, are so intersectional and cross-sector, and therefore the solutions are going to have to be too.
Yeah.
I'll let you start, Tanja.
Sure. Thank you, Patrick. For certainly at NLC, we've realized that, if you're really thinking about success and well-being over the long term, we kind of merged our physical and the physical and human infrastructure. Like, you think about a city, the hardcore things of a city, roads, transportation, broadband. But then you also think about the human side of health, well-being, mental health, early education. And so organizations that are looking at this holistically, and how we have certainly taken a stand of looking at alignment and how, because children and young families or families in general, they operate in a context, and you can't, think about the ecological models. And so folks live in communities. And so you got to take into account the systems that impact, the individual. And so I think for us, the aligning of physical and human infrastructure, looking not just at programs, but at policies and those infrastructure pieces that are fundamental to how a community is thriving or vibrant. So I would just say that, wherever you have that kind of alignment and looking at, the well-being of individuals in the context of which they are living those conditions. And certainly we at NLC have thinking and taken a holistic approach. And so where systems are aligned, and that the work is not top down, but you look at from local community, where parents and providers and community are at the table with those policymakers and those leaders of systems, and where their table set, not, it's not as an afterthought, but but from the inception of re-envisioning and reimagining what communities are going to look like. And I think we're at a moment now where there is going to be a kind of just a general reset. Communities are going to have to reevaluate their mission, their vision, what they want to be known for. And it's a great opportunity in the midst of a lot of this chaos. It's a great opportunity for communities to come together from the ground up and to have traditional and non-traditional partners at the table working together to reset a mission and vision for their community and town. And so I do think this is a moment where we can really kind of reimagine what systems and what we're going to be as we kind of come out of this kind of reset, as the federal government has really pulled back in its investments and support of communities across the nation.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely key. Leon, do you want to chime in? What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
how funders connect? Yeah.
so many gems from Tanya. I'll just add on and say, understanding and truly valuing the power of advocacy and organizing, as a linchpin of true systemic change is important, but also understanding the slow, steady burn of advocacy. And I say this as someone who spent the first 18 years of my career doing direct service as a lawyer representing clients. There's great value in helping the individual, but oftentimes you get the outcome much more quickly. Like if I had a court case, I was getting that outcome within a certain period of time due to the rules of court and speedy trial. Whereas when you're trying to shift the system, there's a level of public education, informing the public on the policy change you want, and uplifting the research and why it makes sense. It's getting buy-in and more people in the public as they learn about the change, coming on board and supporting. It's that build with, changing narratives and getting people to buy in, getting more and more elected officials on your side. It's something that takes time. And so I think sometimes funders can be, mentally can be sort of locked into very rigid guidelines, understanding that there's the art of system reform is in building continuous momentum on the way to that change. And so really, you know, understanding and supporting organizations that are involved in that long game of changing things that affect the entire community or that make an impact for thousands of kids, that's something that I would really, really, really preach.
Great. Thank you, Leon. I know we're a bit over time, so I'd love to just take the next minute or so to give you all the floor for things that are coming up, ways to get involved with the organizations. I'll start with you, Tanja. I know NLC just released a big State of the Cities report. You have a lot going on. This is a busy summer for you all. What should folks know and how can they connect?
Yeah, just to shout out to our research and municipal programs division. We just released the State of the Cities report for 2025, listing the top priorities for cities, driving economic recovery. Infrastructure investments are urgent and under threat. Cities are resilient. So just top 5 priorities for cities. We just also released 2 weeks ago, Decades in the Making. I referenced that earlier. We did in-depth case studies of 4 cities who have been at this for decades, really committed to children and families, and just the how-to steps if you really want to know how cities did the work. And if you think about Boston or Hartford or Jacksonville or Seattle, it really gives you the how-to. And just want to just say, like, at this moment in time, the role of local government is just, it's critical. And we are challenged on a number of sides, but we do also know that, what cities do set a precedent, and success in one city can inspire others and inform state and national action. So we are just thoroughly committed here at the National League of Cities to really support our local leaders, all cities, all geographies, all regions of the country, to make sure that they have what they need to navigate the political landscape, and to hold the ground for families and kids in their communities. And we stand ready to partner with folks like you, Patrick, and others, that we can, hold the line and make sure that cities are strong, and that cities have what they need so that families are strong. So we're excited about this moment as we face so many challenges. But please take a look at those 2 resources, and just in general, all things cities. NLC is the go-to place for local leadership and local governance. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thanks so much, Sandra. I know you've got to hop off for another
I
call.
do,
Thank
I
you again
do.
so much. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Leanne, tell us a bit about how people can get involved with CFJJ and
Yeah.
what's on the horizon for you.
Absolutely. So please go to our website, www.cfjj.org, or follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn at Citizens for Juvenile Justice or at CFJJMA. There you can learn more about our ongoing advocacy campaign. We are in the midst of a legislative session, so we're working really hard. With our coalition members, we have a very robust campaign this session of school to prison pipeline legislation, juvenile justice reform, and reform in the child welfare system. So we're touching on all of those systems and reform. We also are very proud of our research. Again, our advocacy is rooted in research, both that which flows from our community engagement and direct experiences, as well as the data analysis and uplifting of peer-reviewed research that we pull into our own research, as well as other research that we uplift. So we'll be very proud to see you all go, give us a follow, and just follow us along the journey to, again, a lot of things in Boston and Massachusetts are going well, but we're not done. And there's still much more work to be done. There's a lot of inequity still in our systems despite the progress. So we're still moving forward to both make the change that needs to happen, but also make changes in light of what we're seeing on the federal level to try to buttress our cities and our state from some of the harshness of the federal impact. So please give us a follow and just stay along with us on the journey. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Leanne. I'm going to toss up some of the info that we just heard from both of you. Here's how you can make sure you can see the Loving Cities Index, explore it in full. Take a look at all of SHOT's work, as well as Citizens for Juvenile Justices, and of course, the National League of Cities. Thanks again, Leanne, so much for your time. And thanks for everyone who attended. Now go off and build living cities.